One of the questions that we ask ourselves a lot of times as Christians is, how do we go and make an impact for the gospel? How do we spread the gospel, but not only spread it, but how does it actually take root and grow in people's lives? And that's very relevant to today in the 21st century, where it feels like the church is constantly being attacked. And so you think of the early church and how they grew. You know, it started as a small group of Jesus's disciples, and it went out. The gospel, the book of Acts shows that the gospel then went out, and it spread and it spread and it spread throughout the whole earth. And then it continued to gain more and more momentum, and that was in spite of persecution in the church. And so in the early church, there was persecution, and yet it grew rapidly. And so it's here today. And that's, for one, yes, because it's truthful. It shows the truth of the word. But today we're not looking at that necessarily. Hopefully if you're coming to this video, you trust that. And so today it's going to be an equipping kind of day of how did the early church spread their message to the point where it was truly convincing and it truly took root. And so, yes, God was at work, but let's look at how the early church as people were at work, and how did God use them? And so, like I mentioned, martyrdom is one way, and that refers to, martyr means witness, and that means that the people of the early church were witnessing of their faith, to where they witnessed in a time of persecution, and they were martyred, they were killed for their faith. And so as they witnessed, they were killed, and that act of dying for your faith, that was a powerful witness back then, because if somebody is willing to die for their faith, that shows how convinced they are. And it's an even greater scale for when the apostles die, because they claimed to have seen the risen Christ, and they did. And so they're not going to die for something they know is a lie. So that's a whole other section. But today we're going to look at another way the gospel was spread in the early church. And that was through generosity. That was through love, believe it or not. And so we're going to look at Emperor Julian's letter to a priest in Galatia, a pagan priest, because the Emperor Julian is kind of, what would you say, upset, a little concerned about the growth of Christianity. This is in the early 4th century. And as you'll see in his letter, he actually calls Christians atheists. And that was common because in paganism, early in the Roman Empire, you would see worship of many different gods, a pantheon of gods. And if you remember in the book of Acts, they had that statue to the unknown God, because they were like, well, we have all these gods, but maybe there's one we don't know. And so they wanted to have all their bases covered for all the many different gods. And so that's kind of the mindset. And so the difference is, early Christians, they said, no, we don't believe in all these different gods. We don't believe in worshiping an idol even. We don't believe our God can be worshiped through a statue. Our God is spirit, and our God is one. We only believe in one God. And so this was so far different than the culture at that time that it caused them to kind of think that they were almost like atheists. That was kind of a rumor being spread that, oh, they just don't believe in any God because they don't have a statue. So, you know, what are they worshiping? They're not worshiping anything. And so as we read the letter, just know when he says atheists, he means Christians. And he's kind of using that term to describe them because, you know, they're worshiping one God. That's weird. They just call them atheists because they don't subscribe to any of these pagan gods. But let's look at, again, remember, this is a pagan talking about the Christian witness in the church, in the early Roman Empire. And so let's just look at what this emperor has to say. He says in this letter, he goes, "Why then do we think that this is enough? Why do we not observe that it is their benevolence to strangers, their care for the graves of the dead, and the pretended holiness of their lives that have done most to increase atheism? I believe that we ought really and truly to practice every one of these virtues." And he continues in the letter and he goes, "For it is disgraceful that when no Jew ever has to beg, and the impious Galileans support not only their own poor, but ours as well. all men see that that our people lack aid from us. So he's kind of going at these pagans in Galatia. He's like, all of our own people are being cared for by these, terrible atheists or Christians. And he's saying we need to be practicing those things. But of course, the Christians had this huge conviction on loving people, no matter what their status was, to the point where they were caring for these people in such an incredible way. And so we're going to kind of break down the two ways. So in this letter, there's the caring for the graves of the dead. We're going to look at that first. And then secondly, he goes on to talk about essentially generosity. But what does it mean when he says they care for the graves of the dead? Okay, what does that mean? Well, Lactantius, if I'm pronouncing that right, he was a writer in the early church. He wrote on this issue of burying all people, whether or not they were poor or rich, because of everybody was an image, made in the image of God. And so I'm going to quote a few passages from Lactantius in his book he wrote, The Divine Institutes, chapter 12. So let's just look at a couple of these verses and reflect this passage, and let's just kind of reflect on what he's talking about. So he says, the last and greatest office of piety is the burying of strangers and the poor, which subject those teachers of virtue and justice have not touched upon at all. Therefore, we will not suffer the image and workmanship of God to lie exposed as a prey to beasts and birds, but we will restore it to the earth, from which it had its origin. And although it be in the case of an unknown man, we will fulfill the office of relatives, into whose place, since they are wanting, let kindness succeed. And wherever there shall be need of man, there we will think that our duty is required. So he says, if their relatives aren't there to care for them, then we will. He said, we'll fill that office. And you see this great care for the image of God. We're not going to let any person lie exposed to the birds to be preyed upon. No, we're going to bury them. And this was a big deal because burials in the early Roman Empire, they were expensive. And this is why this is a big deal, is because people weren't going to go out of their way to bury a dead person because that's expensive. They didn't want to go through that cost. And their relatives who probably, they wanted a proper burial for them, but didn't have the money. Well, what do you know? Christians who don't even know these people, they go and they pay for the burial and they help bury the dead. Why? Because the Bible teaches in Genesis that everyone is made in the image of God. That's such a profound teaching of that person you don't like, that you don't like at work, you don't like at school, whatever it is. That person is made in the image of God and deserves to be treated with respect. And I wonder if we do that, are we helping the people who can't help us in return? Like, that's what they're doing. Dead people can't help you, but they're serving even those who have passed away because they believe in kindness and generosity, and especially that everyone is made in the image of God. And so that's just one way in which it had such a great effect that Emperor Julian's like, hey guys, what are we doing? They're caring for even the dead they're caring for. We're not even caring for the people that are alive. And so that's the witness of the early church, is they cared for everybody and they showed it in their actions. They didn't just talk about it. And so secondly, let's kind of look at some things about generosity. So to give just one example, there's plenty of examples you could find of this kindness and generosity in the early church, but Polycarp, he wrote a letter to the church in Philippi in the early 2nd century, and he talks about this. And so just to quote this letter briefly and let it sit with you guys, here's what it says. From the beginning, you had the custom of helping all of the brethren in many sorts of ways and sending support to many congregations in all cities. Through these gifts, which you have been sending all along, you have eased the poverty of the needy. So this church is giving to all people, regardless of where they are, who they are. They're easing the poverty of the needy. And this is just it's something that the early church did naturally as a result of the example that Jesus set. And this is what an article named, it's called A Compassionate Christian Community. What did the early church teach that made Christians lovers of the poor? This article talks about this, and it shows how, and you can read it if you want, it's good. The early church really followed the example of Jesus, who was healing the poor and healing the crippled and the lame and the blind and all these different people. Jesus cared for them. He was there for them. He didn't, like the religious leaders of their day, kind of shun the unclean. No, he went there and he went to help them. And so as a result, the Christian community were out there trying to do the same, trying to be helpers of those in need and those who can't do anything for them in return. They want to help them. And encouraging verse that the early church used was Ephesians 2:8-10. Of course, all Christians have used this verse, but they particularly focus on that we were created for good works. That's what Paul talks about in Ephesians. We're created for good works. All right, God has renewed us, regenerated us, and now let's go live in a way that reflects that God in His Spirit, His Holy Spirit, is living through us. Let's go out there and do good. And so, I'm not totally sure what that looks like for you, but I know that one of the ways that we today are going to become just beacons of light in the world is by loving people. The world is so filled with divisions and finger pointing. If Christians are not a part of that, if Christians are head and shoulders in kindness above everybody around them, what is that going to show the world? It's going to show the world that, hey, they're different. They believe in something that is truly changing them, and there might be something to it. And that is how the early church grew. And that's how we're going to grow the church today in part. In part, I say that because, yes, the gospel is important. We want to share the gospel, all right? You're not going to win anybody to Christ if you never share the gospel with them. But at the same time, we should be out there doing good works just out of love for people. And I'd say that through that, God is going to use that for good things. And just to say one last thing of how that looks, I think, yes, immediately in our culture, at least in the American culture, I think a lot of us do give, and that's a good thing. Giving money is great. It's definitely a way to be generous. But a way that we don't think of naturally of how to be generous is with our time. Because time is very valuable. And I think today in America, a lot of us don't suffer from poverty and we give, and that's good. But we don't think about, but part of the reason might be because it's easy to give for some of us, and praise the Lord if that is the case. But it's not so easy to give up your time, right? And a lot of us in today's day and age are busy, and we don't take the time to sacrifice that time and dedicate it to helping others and loving others in generous ways. And I say that as someone who doesn't do it enough myself. And so this is convicting for me, and I hope it convicts you to not to wallow in, oh no, I'm not generous. No, I hope that it encourages you, like, hey, God is working in me and through me right now. Let me go out there and live like it. God is regenerating me. And so let's go and care for people today. And again, those are examples in the early church. Let's think about how we can kind of bring that love and care to everybody today. And it looks differently for different people in different contexts. So I can't tell you exactly how you're going to do it, but hopefully this is encouraging to you that there's hope, and there's hope in love. There's hope in God's love today. And let's just go and live according to the gospel, which is you're saved by grace through faith. Okay, now what? Well, you're created for good works. You're a new creation, and God has dedicated you. He's called you. He's brought you into His family. And so now let's live like it. Let's live like children of God, which we have been made through Jesus Christ. So that's all I've got today. And hopefully you enjoyed church history. It's fun. I enjoyed reading it and teaching about it. So Anyways, other than that, I'll just say have a good day. Like and subscribe if you want to see more content. And other than that, may you go in peace.